They call it the death house. A place where footsteps echo louder than confessions, where the final breath of America's most feared criminals drifts into silence. This is USP Terre Haute, the fortress of steel where the federal government ends lives. Tonight, we walk through the doors that only the condemned ever truly know, and almost none ever leave. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button. It helps us bring you deeper into the world most people fear to even talk about. The road to USP Terre Haute is long, flat, and unsettlingly quiet, almost as if the land itself understands what happens behind those concrete walls. Drivers who pass through Indiana's southwest corridor often speak of the strange aura surrounding the place. It's not a normal prison. It's not even a high-security prison. It is the prison America's federal death row. And the air outside feels heavier, thicker, as if it carries the sum of every last moment that has ever taken place inside. As you approach the front entrance, the sign is unassuming: USP Terre Haute, Federal Correctional Complex. No warnings. No dramatics. The walls speak for themselves. Layers of razor wire shimmer under faded Midwestern sunlight, coiled like serpents guarding a dark secret. Guard towers punctuate the perimeter, each one cold, motionless, and absolutely lethal. And yet, for all the security above ground, the most feared place lies beneath it, down a hallway the public never sees. But before we reach the death house, there's something important to understand. USP Terre Haute was never meant to feel like a standard federal prison. Most American institutions are built around rehabilitation, structure, and, at least in theory, second chances. Here, however, the architecture itself feels like a countdown clock. Every block, every corridor, every locked steel door is designed with one reality in mind: someone inside is scheduled to die. There are no lifers hoping for appeal victories, no inmates preparing for parole, no dream of release on the horizon. Everyone in the Special Confinement Unit, the SCU, is either waiting for a date the government has already set, or fighting through endless legal motions to delay the inevitable. But the system, cold and administrative, always keeps moving. And the first step toward that final walk begins at the front gate, where new arrivals are transported under silence and extreme security. When the unmarked vehicles roll in, no one outside is told who is inside. Some inmates come quietly, exhausted and resigned after decades of appeals. Others arrive furious, hurling threats and curses through reinforced restraints. But once they cross that threshold, it doesn't matter who they were on the outside. The walls here change everyone. Inside the reception area, the strip lighting hums faintly, creating long shadows that dance across pale blue walls. Every sound is sharp: paper sliding across a desk, keys clinking, chains tightening. Staff speaking clipped, efficient tones. No one wastes a word. Every action is procedural. Emotion is checked at the door. This is the home of the most dangerous, most infamous, and most heavily guarded inmates in the federal system. As new prisoners are processed, their identities are verified, fingerprints confirmed, and belongings taken. The guards already know who they are. Their names have filled newsrooms, congressional hearings, courtroom transcripts. Some committed crimes so horrific they altered federal laws. Others were foot soldiers of hate groups, drug cartels, and extremist movements. And yet, in this place, they are not celebrities. They are cases, carefully managed until their final chapter. Once processed, the escort team leads them down a long, sterile hallway toward the SCU. The sound of boots on concrete echoes ominously, as if announcing the arrival of another life the government has placed on hold. The corridor is lined with security checkpoints, steel doors that slide open only after identity scans and verbal confirmations. Every door shuts with a slam that reverberates through the bones. Then comes the moment every new inmate remembers for the rest of their surviving days. The entrance to the Special Confinement Unit. The SCU is its own world. A self-contained block, isolated from the rest of the prison population. It is quiet, eerily so. There is no typical prison noise. No shouting from cells. No clanking weight benches. No card games. Only silence, broken by the occasional distant cough or the low hum of air filtration designed specifically for the unit. Cells are small, stark, and heavily monitored, each outfitted with thick plexiglass designed to prevent violence, self-harm, or the crafting of weapons. Inmates rarely interact. Contact is minimal, movements controlled, and privileges restricted. Everything is documented. Everything is watched. In the SCU, time stretches in strange ways. Days blend, nights drag. Inmates wake, eat, shower, and sleep knowing the clock is ticking even if they don't know how close they are to the end. Some spend their time writing endless appeals to courts that have already denied them. Others turn inward, reading religious texts, journaling, or withdrawing into a numb, quiet existence. And some slip into a kind of anxious acceptance, speaking very little as they wait for the knock on the door that will one day come. Because somewhere in this building, though hidden from their view, is the death house. And every inmate knows that when their time comes, they will take the walk toward that cold chamber where the federal government carries out its most final act. But before we enter that chamber ourselves, before we explore the men, the procedures, the controversies, and the final minutes of those who met their end here, we must first understand the history of how Terre Haute became the center of America's ultimate punishment. And that story begins long before any inmate ever stepped through these gates. Long before the world called it the death house, the land where USP Terre Haute stands was little more than quiet farmland and old railroad paths cutting through Indiana. The federal government had no grand plan at first, no vision of creating the epicenter of capital punishment. But history has a strange way of turning ordinary soil into infamous ground. To understand why this prison became America's federal execution hub, you must step back almost a century, to a time when the nation was rethinking how it punished its most violent offenders. In the early 1930s, crime in the United States was shifting. Prohibition had birthed new empires of organized criminals, syndicates willing to kill federal agents, blow up buildings, and terrorize entire communities. The government needed a stronger federal justice system. As a result, the Bureau of Prisons began expanding, building institutions that could safely hold the growing number of offenders under federal jurisdiction. Indiana, with its central location and open land, was seen as the perfect place for a new penitentiary. In 1938, construction began on what would eventually become one of the most significant federal complexes in the country. But at this time, there was no death house. No lethal injection chamber. No federal death row. That would come later after a wave of political tension, legal battles, and national debates. During the mid-20th century, executions were carried out in various states, often in outdated facilities. The federal government relied heavily on state resources to execute those convicted under federal law. But as legal reforms reshaped the criminal justice landscape, the need for a centralized location grew stronger. The turning point came in 1994, when the Federal Death Penalty Act expanded the list of federal crimes eligible for execution. Terrorism, murder for hire, espionage, major drug trafficking cases, these were crimes the government wanted handled with absolute control and consistency. Scattering executions across various states created logistical chaos and political complications. The solution was clear. One location. One system. One method. USP Terre Haute was chosen not because of its brutality, but because of its design isolated enough for security, large enough to expand, and already home to a high-security population. During the late 1990s, construction crews worked quietly, adding a sealed unit deep within the complex, a place with no windows, no public access, and one purpose. That was the beginning of the Special Confinement Unit, the SCU, and the adjoining death house. But even after construction finished, the chamber sat unused for years. Appeals, legal reforms, and shifting political winds delayed the federal government's return to executions. Then, in June of 2001, history broke its long silence. Timothy McVeigh, the man responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing, became the first federal inmate executed in Terre Haute. Overnight, the world's cameras turned toward Indiana. Reporters, protesters, and grieving families all converged on the small city. Many Americans didn't even know where Terre Haute was until that moment. Inside the prison, the atmosphere was surreal. Staff had trained for years, rehearsing every detail, from the escort procedures to the chemical sequence of the lethal injection. Yet no amount of preparation could fully steel them for the reality of taking a human life under the authority of the federal government. Some officers described that day as eerily calm. There were no riots, no disruptions. Just a quiet tension, as if the entire institution was collectively holding its breath. When the execution was carried out, the world's attention confirmed a new truth. USP Terre Haute was now the heart of America's death penalty. Over the next 2 decades, the prison became home to dozens of the country's most dangerous individuals, mass murderers, serial killers, cartel leaders, domestic terrorists, white supremacist radicals, and more. Each arrival hardened Terre Haute's identity. The staff evolved into specialists, the only federal team experienced in the logistics, psychology, and legal intricacies of scheduled executions. They learned how to navigate the emotional complexity of escorting men toward their final minutes. Some officers became numb, detaching themselves emotionally. Others never got used to it. Records show that even the strongest employees wrestled with the weight of working inside a place where, at any moment, someone could be given a date that marked the end of their life. Many retired early. Some sought counseling. A few refused to work in the SCU entirely. Because the truth is, the death house doesn't just change inmates. It changes staff, too. The execution chamber itself is small, colder than most rooms in the prison. Sterile. Clinical. Designed with intentional simplicity. Nothing inside draws attention except the gurney, a metal-framed bed with thick restraints. For inmates, it is the last thing they will ever lay on. Beyond the chamber is the witness room, divided into sections. One side for victims' families. Another for the inmate's family or representatives. And the final side for officials and media. The walls are soundproof. The glass is reinforced. Yet even in silence, the room carries a heaviness that presses against the chest. But Terre Haute isn't only infamous for its executions. It's infamous for the years leading up to them, the lawsuits, the psychological battles, the countdowns, the last meals, the last words, the controversies, and the impossible decisions made in those final hours. Behind each execution lies a labyrinth of policy, ethics, and human emotion. And that's where our story deepens. Because before we walk into the death house itself, we must step into the lives of those who lived and waited inside the SCU. Men whose crimes shook the country. Men whose appeals shaped federal law. Men whose names you already know, and men whose stories have been buried under decades of fear. Their world is unlike any other inside the American justice system. And chapters 3 and onward will take us directly inside it. The Special Confinement Unit is unlike any other place in the federal system. To outsiders, it looks like a simple prison wing, sterile walls, narrow hallways, standard-issue steel doors. But the moment you step inside, you can feel it. A shift in the air. A tightening in your chest. A silence that doesn't feel peaceful, but suspended, like the world is holding its breath. This is federal death row. A place built on the tension between life and the final step the government has promised to take. The SCU houses inmates who have exhausted decades of appeals, inmates who still file motions weekly, and inmates who haven't yet processed the reality of their sentence. But regardless of where they are mentally, one truth unites them. No one here leaves alive unless their conviction is overturned. Cells stretch down the long central corridor, each identical in size and design. White concrete walls, reinforced windows with thick plexiglass, a bed fixed to the floor, and a small desk bolted into place. The design minimizes risk, no loose parts, no sharp edges, no gaps for hiding contraband. Even the toilets are stainless steel, molded into seamless units to prevent tampering. In most prisons, inmates shout, argue, laugh, or slam chess pieces on metal tables. But in the SCU, noise is rare. Voices stay low. Movement is controlled. And the silence creates an atmosphere where every sound, a cough, a shuffle, a guard's radio crackling, echoes like it's happening in an empty cathedral. Isolation is part of the system. Death row inmates spend roughly 22 to 23 hours a day inside their cells. The remaining time involves a tightly controlled routine, shower periods, brief outdoor recreation in a caged yard, and occasional appointments with legal counsel or psychological staff. But even these moments are different from traditional prisons. Recreation is solitary, no basketball games, no shared conversations. Just a single inmate under the wide, open sky, pacing in circles alone. Many have said that this is the moment they finally realize how small their world has become. Despite the isolation, the guards know the men on this range better than most corrections officers ever know their inmates. With such a small population, interactions become strangely intimate. Officers learn who draws every morning, who writes letters obsessively, who sleeps little, who sings quietly to pass time, who spends hours staring at the wall, and who constantly checks their legal papers for updates that never come. There are no cellmates in the SCU. As a rule, death row inmates are single-celled. Some inmates talk to each other through vents or yell down the tier, but the interactions are distant. The environment isn't designed for survival through companionship. It's designed to maintain order in a unit where emotions run deep and hope often runs thin. Every inmate reacts to death row differently. Some maintain a sense of routine. They write, read, exercise, or work on legal strategies until their knuckles ache from gripping a pen. They count calories, track time, and follow workout routines carved from military manuals. It's their way of controlling the only things they still can, their body and their mind. Others spiral inward. Days become indistinguishable. Nights grow long. They spend hours on their bunk with the blanket pulled to their chin, lost in thoughts no one else can hear. These inmates often become quiet, calm, and emotionless, not out of peace, but out of fatigue. After years of appeals, years of waiting, years of waking up knowing tomorrow might bring a death warrant, something inside them begins to dim. And then there are the restless ones, the inmates who pound on doors, curse the staff, shout legal theories at anyone who will listen, or sink into paranoia. The psychological weight of death row has broken some of the toughest men. Staff members have witnessed inmates deteriorate slowly, piece by piece, year by year, until they no longer resemble the person who arrived. Some inmates, strangely, become polite, grateful even. Facing mortality changes people. Men who once showed no remorse may shift, apologizing for small inconveniences, thanking officers, or writing letters expressing emotions they never showed in the outside world. But calmness doesn't always mean acceptance. In the SCU, every behavior is layered with fear, anger, denial, or resignation. And beneath it all lies one unspoken truth. These men are living in the shadow of a room they hope to never see. That room, the execution chamber, sits hidden behind thick walls, out of view yet always present in their minds. Some inmates stare at the ceiling at night imagining what the gurney looks like, how the restraints feel, what the final injection might burn like. Others shove those thoughts away until the day they receive the notice. The notice is the moment nearly every inmate dreads. Legal staff and administrators approach a cell, knock, and quietly hand over a sealed document. Inside is their execution date. The walk to that cell is solemn. The air in the unit changes. Inmates go silent as the officers move down the tier. No one wants to hear the knock. No one wants to see that envelope. When an execution date is set, the inmate is transferred out of regular SCU housing and placed under close observation. Every interaction becomes scheduled, monitored, recorded. Their meals change. Their recreation changes. Their visits increase. And the countdown begins. But before we dive into the final days, before last meals, last words, and the final walk, we must meet some of the men whose stories shaped Terre Haute's terrifying legacy. Men whose crimes were so shocking, the nation demanded their deaths. Men whose names still haunt the history of American violence. Men who lived inside these walls with the knowledge that the government was preparing to end their lives. And that story begins with one of the most infamous inmates ever housed here. To understand the story of USP Terre Haute, you must understand the men who lived inside its most secretive wing, the Special Confinement Unit. This is not a place for petty criminals, gang enforcers, or hardened lifers who stabbed their way through maximum security prisons. Terre Haute's death row houses a different category entirely. These are the men whose crimes shaped national policy, changed federal law, and shook the American psyche. When their names hit headlines, they weren't just local cases, they were national tragedies. Their trials filled television screens. Their verdicts sparked debates. Their sentences were followed by years of appeals, protests, and political battles. They are the reason the SCU feels heavy even when empty. When you walk through the tier, if you're ever allowed, the cells look identical. A number. A window. A door. But behind each door was a story that once terrified the nation. Some of these men became symbols of terror. Others symbols of hate. Others symbols of the coldest form of human cruelty. And for every man who accepted his guilt, there was another who never stopped claiming innocence, even with overwhelming evidence stacked against him. Let's step into some of these stories, not to glorify, not to sensationalize, but to understand why Terre Haute became the center of America's most controversial punishment. The first name that inevitably emerges is Timothy McVeigh. Though executed in 2001, his presence never truly left the SCU. His arrival brought global attention, setting the precedent for Terre Haute's modern identity. McVeigh lived in the same type of cell every death row inmate would later occupy. He followed the same routines, breathed the same recycled air, walked the same narrow corridors. Guards still recall his calm demeanor, his detached conversations, his strange blend of politeness and ideological coldness. His execution was the beginning of the federal government's reactivation of capital punishment, and years later, every new inmate knew they were entering the place where McVeigh's story ended. But McVeigh was only one name etched into Terre Haute's walls. Another inmate whose story became infamous was Daniel Lewis Lee, part of a white supremacist group involved in a brutal triple murder. His case, tangled in controversy and appeals, would eventually become the first federal execution in 17 years when the government resumed executions in 2020. His final words echoed through the chamber, challenging the government's narrative and claiming innocence until the final moment. Whether he was telling the truth will forever be debated by those who followed the case. Then there was Dylan Roof, the young man whose acts of racial violence shocked the nation in 2015. He walked into a Charleston church, sat with worshippers who welcomed him with open arms, and then opened fire. His writings and courtroom behavior reflected an unwavering commitment to hate. Roof arrived at the SCU almost emotionless, detached, seemingly unbothered by the weight of 10 consecutive death sentences. Other inmates spoke of him rarely. Staff described him as unnervingly calm. When you mention his name inside Terre Haute, conversations stop. Even among convicted killers, some crimes leave a shadow that never lifts. Another figure whose presence stirred deep emotion was Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, one of the Boston Marathon bombers. His story is tied to one of the darkest days in American sports history. Unlike many death row inmates who arrive in middle age, Tsarnaev entered the SCU barely into adulthood. His age created moral and legal debates that continue today. Should someone so young face execution? His legal battle is still active, with rulings overturned and reinstated through political climates and Supreme Court decisions. As a result, Tsarnaev's cell light remains on. His story continues. Some inmates were less known but equally chilling. Serial killers whose crimes filled boxes of evidence. Drug lords whose operations left communities shattered. Domestic terrorists who plotted bombings that were stopped only by surveillance and luck. Murderers who killed federal officers, witnesses, or innocent families. Each one entered Terre Haute with a criminal record that weighed heavier than the thick steel doors sealing them inside. But here is an unusual truth many don't expect. Inside the SCU, these men are not the monsters the world knows. In interviews, guards often say the same thing. The inmates on federal death row are some of the most polite, calm, and compliant inmates they've ever supervised. Not because they're rehabilitated, but because the environment forces introspection and because they have nothing left to lose except time. In this world, violence is rare. Outbursts are uncommon. Most inmates spend their days reading legal documents, religious texts, or writing letters. Staff interactions become oddly human. Officers talk about the weather. Inmates ask about football games or family holidays. Some draw. Some study law. One inmate is known for sketching remarkable portraits that never leave his cell. Another spends hours memorizing Bible verses. Another writes detailed journals that will never be published. Yet beneath these routines lies the same common fear, the fear of the knock on the door, the day their appeals run out, the moment their name becomes the next headline. Even for the most notorious inmates, execution is not a topic they speak of openly. Some avoid it entirely. Some joke darkly about it. Some accept it quietly. A few claim they welcome it. And some live in denial until the very last second. But no matter who they are, terrorist, killer, radical, or criminal mastermind, once the government sets an execution date, every inmate on the range feels it. The air grows heavier. Conversations drop. A strange tension flows from cell to cell. Because when one man is scheduled to die, it reminds everyone else that their turn is coming. And for the man whose name appears on that paper, the next chapter of his life and our documentary turns into one of the most psychologically intense journeys in the entire American prison system. The final days before execution. That story begins next. Inside the special confinement unit, time feels repetitive until the day it suddenly isn't. Everything changes the moment an inmate is given an execution date. It is the single most feared, most emotionally devastating moment in the entire federal system. And for the staff, it is the beginning of a long, meticulously controlled process. In the SCU, news doesn't travel by whisper or rumor. It travels through the atmosphere. Officers walk differently. Their radios stay quieter. Supervisors appear more frequently. Even inmates who are years away from their own dates instinctively sense the shift. A strange heaviness fills the tier. The knock on the door is always the same, firm, deliberate, and unforgettable. The inmate is asked to approach the cell window. A warden or high-ranking officer stands outside, flanked by legal staff and correctional supervisors. They do not raise their voices. They do not draw it out. They simply confirm the inmate's name and slide a sealed document through the door slot. Inside that envelope is the official execution warrant. In that moment, the inmate's entire universe collapses into a single sheet of paper. All the years of appeals, motions, emergency stays, and legal arguments have finally reached the end. For some, it feels like the world stops spinning. They lose strength in their knees. Others explode in rage, shouting, kicking the door, blaming lawyers, judges, politicians, or God. And some, those who have already made peace, simply nod, stare at the envelope, and sit quietly on their bunk. But no matter how each man reacts, the same process begins. First, the inmate is removed from the regular death row unit and placed into a special range known informally as the Death Watch. The cell is identical in size, but everything about the routine changes. Extra monitoring. Extra staff. No contact with other inmates. No uncertainty about why they're here. Their world shrinks even further. The inmate now receives round-the-clock surveillance. Officers must check on him constantly. There is no moment of privacy, not during meals, not during showers, not during sleep. This is not meant to punish, it is meant to prevent self-harm. The responsibility of ensuring that the government, not the inmate, controls the timing of death is enormous. Psychologists begin visiting more frequently, assessing the inmate's mental state. Medical staff keep detailed records. Chaplains come by to discuss spiritual needs. Legal teams increase their visits, sometimes daily, sometimes multiple times a day. The inmate's schedule becomes a blur of conversations, paperwork, reflection, and internal panic. On death row, time felt slow. On death watch, it accelerates. The inmate is allowed more phone calls, but each one is monitored. They can request specific visitors, and most families come if they can bear it. Some approach with tears and trembling hands. Others with bitterness. Some refuse to come at all, unable to face the reality. A strange truth emerges during this phase. Even the most hardened criminals often break emotionally, not for themselves, but for the pain their families feel. Mothers cry through thick glass partitions. Siblings apologize for things that happened decades ago. Estranged relatives sometimes reappear, hoping to repair broken ties before the state ends everything. Officers who supervise these interactions admit they're some of the hardest moments of their careers. They must stand close, remain professional, and never show emotion, yet the scenes play out like heartbreak on repeat. As the days pass, the preparations begin. The inmate must choose a last meal, though many decline. Hollywood portrays extravagant requests, but the reality is far simpler: limited menus, strict restrictions, and sometimes no appetite. Next comes the paperwork. Wills. Property lists. Belongings assigned to family. Burial or cremation choices. Final letters. Final statements. These documents are written under the watchful eye of staff, but there is no rush. Every word, every signature feels like a piece of the inmate's identity being wrapped up and sealed away. Meanwhile, officers rehearse the execution procedure repeatedly. Everyone has a specific role. No one is allowed to deviate. Even the smallest misstep can ruin the legality of the process. They practice escort formations, restraint procedures, communication codes, and emergency contingencies. Not because they expect resistance, most inmates walk calmly, but because precision is mandatory when the government is taking a life. As the date approaches, tension builds. In the final 72 hours, the atmosphere becomes noticeably heavier. Some inmates grow agitated, pacing endlessly. Others fall into an eerie calm. Many become introspective, writing letters or reading spiritual texts late into the night. A select few request radio time to hear music or news, their last connection to the world beyond the razor wire. The world outside the prison begins to react too. Protesters gather at the gates. Media vans assemble. Journalists prepare for live coverage. Victims' families travel in. Federal officials finalize witness lists. Inside the SCU, inmates grow quiet. When the lights dim at night, you can almost feel the collective tension coming from every cell. Every man knows that someone among them is counting down the final hours and that someday, it will be their turn. Finally, the night before the execution arrives. The inmate is allowed a last phone call. A last shower. A last opportunity for a religious visit. Every action is documented. Every moment is observed. Some inmates break down at this point, overwhelmed by the finality. Others seem strangely peaceful, exhausted by years of fighting. Officers assigned to the detail prepare mentally, some pray, some stay silent, some avoid eye contact with the inmate they've supervised for years. They know the next day will stay with them forever. As midnight passes, the countdown begins in earnest. There is no sleep for most. Not for the inmate. Not for the staff. Not for the witnesses waiting outside the gates. Because sunrise marks the beginning of the end. In the next chapter, we walk through the final hours, from the last sunrise the inmate sees, to the walk down the corridor that leads directly into the death house. When you walk out of the special confinement unit for the last time, whether as a staff member ending a shift, a witness leaving the execution chamber, or simply someone who has learned the truth behind those walls, something in you changes. Federal death row is not a place you forget. It's not a story that fades or a memory that softens with time. It leaves an imprint. In the SCU, you see humanity in its most compressed form: guilt, denial, regret, anger, faith, fear, hope, and resignation all living inches apart. You see officers performing a job that few understand and even fewer could endure. You see men confronting the end of their own existence with a mix of dread and acceptance. And you see a system that moves with deliberate, unstoppable momentum once the machinery of justice is set in motion. But outside those walls, life keeps going: cars passing on the highway, families eating dinner, children playing in yards, people laughing at things that suddenly feel too light to be real. Stepping back into that world feels strange at first, like re-entering the atmosphere after traveling to a place most people will never witness. The truth is this: nothing about death row is simple. Not for those who live there. Not for those who work there. Not for those who wait on the outside. And not for anyone who chooses to understand it. If this guide has done anything, I hope it stripped away the myths and exposed the human reality underneath. The SCU isn't a movie set or a legend whispered in crime forums. It's a real place full of real people whose stories, however dark, deserve to be understood with honesty. Because understanding is the first step toward clarity. And clarity is the only way to confront something as heavy as the federal death penalty.